Kristen, I love the way you changed your voice for that.
Yeah, that was very...
I'm very professional. Leslie, congratulations on your award with Eugene. It's very good.
Oh, thank you.
Very nice.
We're going to lay some eggs.
Yeah. I was going to ask who was the chicken and who was the egg, but I thought I would leave that.
Yeah. That you just blew my whole joke for the acceptance.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
Thanks for that. Okay.
Sorry.
I had a whole routine workout.
Well,
Now
no one heard it.
Something else.
No one heard it.
Getting lots of great emails with the a lot of puns. We're getting a lot of puns.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
Mmm.
Eggs.
That's good. I'm just going to go check in the festival organizers page and make sure there aren't any questions. If everyone who's listening while you're waiting, if you have some questions that are burning a hole in your brain that you'd like to make sure are answered today, please go ahead and start typing them into the chat room box. And then we'll make sure that Leslie and Colin get to them today. For those just joining us, we're going to get started in just a couple minutes. We're watching people enter the room, and we'll be with you shortly. Who's typing away there? We can hear you.
That's me. I'm sorry. I'll mute.
It's okay. That's okay.
Right.
Are all these little boxes EWCHRHRW? Are those people coming in? Oh, look at that.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, I'm gonna do it. Should we just get started and start having an intro conversation?
Yeah.
What do you think?
That'd be great.
Okay, hi everybody. This is I'm Kristen McCracken, and I'm a member of the executive committee of the IFP Festival Forum, and I want to welcome you today to our second in a series of webinars designed to keep communications open between and among our members during throughout the year. Also, coming up in September is IFP Film Week, and Jody, do you want to say a couple words about that? If you're
Sure.
there, Jody.
Yeah, Independent Film Week. It's going to be the Tuesday and Wednesday of that week, and we have sessions from 11 o'clock to 2 o'clock on both days, and are going to be looking at some of the digging deeper in some of the things that we've covered in these webinars on budgeting and marketing, but then also looking at other areas like the new landscape for festival submissions with kind of the new services that are on the scene that John Gann's going to kind of talk through, having used all of them and having developed some really good strategies around that. And then we also have a great session with Harmony Institute looking at their new impact tool and how that might apply to festivals down the line in measuring their own impact around films that they show at their festivals. So it'll be good session.
Great, and if you want to learn more about that, there's a few things you can do. You can either go to ifpfestivalforum.com, or you can visit us on Facebook. There are links there that show how you might be able to register for IFP Film Week and generate a discount for members. So without further ado, I think we'll, so that's happening in September, and then the next webinar won't be until October, because September we all have enough going on, and we hope to see you in New York. I just want to say a couple words about the group chat. If you haven't already, click the little chat balloon button down at the bottom right of your screen of your Fuse app, and that should bring up the chat room window, and you should see that I just posted something. And we can use this throughout the webinar for a place to ask questions if you have questions along the way. Leslie and Colin, I think, are very open to having you guys having you help guide the conversation that we're going to have today. They want to make sure it's as useful for you as possible. So I'll be moderating the chat, and if things pop up that people want to discuss, then I'll bring them into the conversation that Leslie and Colin are having. So without further ado, Colin Stanfield and Lesli Klainberg, would you guys like to introduce yourselves and say hello?
Go ahead.
Sure. So Leslie and I are colleagues at the moment, and we're in her office at the Film Society at Lincoln Center. I've started recently and have been brought on as the festival producer for this year's New York Film Festival, bringing a lot of varied festival experience here. I'm excited to be working with the team.
Yeah. I'm Lesli Klainberg. I'm the executive director of the Film Society, and I've been in this position since last January, but previous to that, I've worked as the managing director of the Film Society and have produced the last 3 New York Film Festivals, in addition to working as a ED of New Fest and as a documentary filmmaker for about 25 years as well.
Great. So we're in good hands. Do you guys want to just kick it off?
Sure. So in trying to come up with a format for this, it's a little difficult to know or anticipate the level of expertise that we are dealing with. And so that's one of the things we were hoping to poll the group with, what the level of...
Are you guys hearing that?
I'm hearing a bit of a buzz. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I can hear that.
I can hear it too.
All right, Robert, I just muted you. I think you were the one making the noise, so sorry about that.
Okay.
You can use the chat room to communicate.
So basically, the outline we have for this session is fairly basic, with a lot of time left for the how, and that's fairly anecdotal. And we're going to talk a little bit about our personal approaches, but thought we'd just start with sort of a general discussion on why one would endeavor to budget. I think one of the things as a festival organizer or an administrator, executive directors, of which Leslie is one, and I have been, you find yourself in this position that you might not be that familiar with, which is sort of the legal aspects of running a non-for-profit, and the elements of governance and board fiduciary responsibilities and whatnot. You end up having a kind of a crash course quite quickly. And in the case of a lot of small organizations, it might not be that buttoned up. So on one hand, you're responsible to the board. They're your employer. They are ultimately responsible for the organization, but many of them might not be as hands-on as you would hope with regard to the sort of basic underlying elements of making sure that the nonprofit is running in a way that adheres to sort of the legal requirements. So one of the chief pieces and responsibilities of a board is to ensure that there is a budget, that there is a process in place that for its approval, and that it's being monitored and reported on a regular basis. So I think we have to start there. As an executive director or a chief administrator, or the director of finance in an organization, you have to do this in order to create a certain comfort level with the board, so that they can feel that they're on top of that bit. I think once you start getting into your planning process, the budgets become a tool for your programmatic vision. And the process of involving your staff and the discussions on both the board level and the staff, your priorities from a mission point of view need to be reflected in the budget. And I think that's where the sort of the rubber meets the road, truly. And I think that becomes one of the more creative aspects of budgeting. Leslie, do you want to talk a bit about that? Because I'm sure that's...
I think, budgeting is, it's very, very, it's just it's fundamental. And, I will say something just quickly just about budgeting, which is something that I think is sort of the tough love part of this, which is like, suck it up. You got to have a budget, and you have to, be comfortable with the fact that you have to put some stuff in writing. And sometimes that can be very daunting when you're running a smaller festival, because you don't even know what you're putting down, because you're like, well, we don't really spend a lot of money, or our budget is very small. It doesn't really matter how big or small your budget is. You still have to have a budget that is helping you and guide you in your plan of execution for your festival. And I think Colin has landed on something important, which is that, most often, most festivals are not for profits. Not every single festival, but virtually all festivals are. and many are part of a bigger not-for-profit organization. So for some folks, and I can't say I know how everyone out there is situated, but for some people, the festival is the not-for-profit. That's all there is. It's the festival. That's what you do. People give money for it. You get grants for it. Whatever it is, the festival is the essence of what the mission and the work is that you're doing. For other folks, and I think, our example here at the Film Society or San Francisco Film Society or Tribeca or any other, many other places are that, there's a year-round organization that is working, and part of the year-round work is this big festival. For some of us, there are multiple festivals every year. For some people, there's only one big festival. It varies, but depending on the scale of the festival and the scale of the organization, you may have different fiduciary responsibilities, either to a board or sponsors. It really depends. But it doesn't, I guess what I would say is it doesn't really matter. You still need to have a budget. And even if the budget's just for you as a producer of the festival and 2 other people, that's okay. It's just that budgeting is a plan, and it shouldn't feel, I say it's sort of like you can't be scared of the budget. Budgeting is an art in some ways, but it's also not math class. And I think when people get it in their head that, well, I'm not good at math, or I never was good at it, or what do I, this is not about a math exercise. It's really about an organizational and planning exercise. The math part is definitely a part of it, because you have to put some numbers together, and there are formulas and things that you have to be careful about. But ultimately, a budget is really about a plan. It's not only about what the number is that you're putting in on the piece of paper. And I've worked on budgets, I've been on festivals where our budget was $100,000. Like, that's the budget for the whole festival. I've worked on a festival where the budget is $1 million. But my budget doesn't change. The budget plan doesn't change. It's just what numbers are put into the budget. And maybe it's the number of people that you hire and things like that. But basic elements of the budget, stay the same. There's income,
Lesli,
there are expenses that are kind of standard and, again, oriented to scale. But the one thing that would be great to accomplish for anyone is for folks just not to be scared of budgeting, because it's really not that scary. It's something that you just have to kind of get used to, and you have to have a plan. And most of us who have been working a long time, either in film production or in festival work, understand the importance of the budget, because so many other people are looking to you to follow it. This is the essence of what you've been tasked with, particularly with a not-for-profit, is that you want to keep within your budget. You have to have some responsibility for what you're spending in addition to what you're bringing.
Lesli, can I jump in here just with a question from the chat room that Jody's asking?
Right now, nobody wants to say anything.
No, I think that it would be helpful to get into some specifics if you can, because Jody's asking, are there good rules of thumb for what percentage of your budget should be allocated to specific line items? Or should there be? And I also, before we say that, I just want to make sure that everyone who can hear us can make sure you join the group chat. Click the chat bubble down on the bottom right of your screen, or that's where it is on my screen. So join the conversation and you can ask your questions there. So this is a question about rules of thumb for percentages.
Yeah, I honestly can't say I have a percentage rule about anything. I think I just don't, because the thing about festivals is that they can be very different from each other, in the sense that when we used to do New Fest here in New York, the biggest expense, absolutely 100%, was a theater. We had to pay a lot of money for the theater. We didn't have access to a theater. That can be oppressive and very difficult, and can be the biggest part of your budget. Some people have plenty of access to theater and access to, equipment and everything, but they don't have any money, cash, and so they have a hard time bringing filmmakers in.
So when you say that your budget doesn't change, just the numbers change, what do you mean by that then?
What I mean is that the line items in the budget don't change. So,
Okay.
and what I can do after this seminar today is that I don't know how you do it, someone will tell me how, but I can post a sample budget for people to look at.
Mm-hmm.
But just as for an example, like if you have festival expenses, you know, you might have a line that's for operations, for an operations manager, for a print traffic coordinator, an event coordinator,
Mm-hmm.
volunteer coordinator, but you may not every festival can afford an event coordinator. So maybe you don't have one in that iteration of this festival, or the event coordinator, you know, their rate is a lot less than maybe what I have here, or the number of weeks may be less than what I might have in a standard budget. I mean, there are variables, but I guess what I'm just suggesting is that, you know, in terms of a template for a budget, you can there is a way to kind of have a standard template that might include your operational aspect of your budget, your venue or your theater part of your budget, the box office part of your budget, an event part of your budget, a promotional part of your budget, programmatic part of your budget, which might include film rentals and print shipping or duplication if that's required. There may be a filmmaker part of your budget that's around a filmmaker coordinator or filmmaker travel or filmmaker awards. Not every film festival gives out awards. You may be working at a festival where you fly in 20 people, and so you really need a filmmaker coordinator. You may be working on a festival that has very few people coming in, and so maybe you don't need it for that particular festival. So, you know what I mean? Like there's,
Yeah,
uh,
I agree, and that, you know, that's one of the things that, as someone who's introduced to budgeting for the first time, and I'm still fairly, you know, close to trying to get buttoned up on this regard. And this is one of the things that uh, I feel like over the years, this has been a more important part of um, the budgeting process for me, which is to create financial statements or a budget format that resembles sort of regular financial statements. And I think that's one of the things that we as arts, people who are working in the arts, struggle with a little bit, is that there's a perception that the financial management in the arts isn't as buttoned up as it would be in other sectors. And so I think it's important that there's a certain familiarity with financial terms. It doesn't need to be becoming a chartered accountant, but you know, being familiar with those terms. And then I also think, and I'm a bit of a stickler for detail, or have become, I think that when you create a budget, it should look pretty professional. And I've been in so many meetings where people pull budgets out with huge flowery fonts and colored lines all over the place and whatnot. And I really think, you know, if you're going to present a budget to a board, you're inevitably going to have a couple of finance people on that board. And I think you do yourself a disservice by not, you know, representing the organization's finances in a way that, you know, seems conventional. So that's just a little bit of a, you know, how I'm feeling about things. And before we get into the how of budgeting, I thought I'd just throw some of these terms up here, because not everyone uses them the same way. For example, you know, the income statement, which is sort of one of the pillars of your financial reporting, that along with the balance sheet is often called the P&L, or in some cases your general ledger. And I think that tool, that financial report, the detailed P&L, is at the heart of the beginning of any serious budgeting effort. You have to know what every single line is that has been spent over the course of the year. You kind of have to have a general awareness of the bookkeeping process, because things will show up on your P&L and it's not entirely clear why there's a bunch of journal entries. You know, why is that coming in as a negative number or whatnot. So my approach to that is you start with that detailed P&L for the entire year and a scratch pad and a blank budget and a highlighter. And I go through every single line and highlight it only after I know what it is, whether I think it's been coded correctly, or whether it's something that might be consolidated in a different category in a way that sort of makes more sense to me. Because ultimately, when you're creating a budget, it's a deeply kind of personal thing. You have to get a handle on the whole year's expenses and be able to talk about them from an informed point of view. So that's one of the most important pieces. Just kind of scrolling through this other list of terms and getting ready for this, I scrolled through some Wikipedia entry for financial terms, and there were literally hundreds. But this group that I put on this slide is basically the only ones that I felt like I talked about on a regular basis. So the income statement and the balance sheet. The balance sheet, as you probably all know, is just a snapshot of where your finances are at any given moment. I actually didn't find that it was a particularly needed financial report very often, except when you're in a board meeting, they want to know what your accounts receivable and payables are in any debt, because that's the snapshot of where you are at any moment. But sort of when you're dealing with your day-to-day, balance sheet is not as important, I found. So chart of accounts, this is just your line items and the numbers that when you print out every single line, they all have a representative in the chart of accounts. Accounts payable and accounts receivable are pretty self-explanatory. When we're talking about managing cash flow, and we can talk about that a little bit, because I think the cash flow budget is another critical tool for financial management. These are important things to be able to track. Cash versus accrual counting. Just as a very simple rule, cash accounting records the transaction when the cash is actually in the bank or it changes hands. Accrual accounting records that when the expense or the income is recorded or is initiated. So if you have a receivable, it's there even though the money, it's recorded even though the money hasn't received your account. I think just while we're having this conversation, just sort of an awareness about these items. A bookkeeper versus an accountant, like a registered chartered accountant, and audited financial statements. Your bookkeeper isn't an accountant necessarily, just someone who knows how to use that bookkeeping software well enough to input your transactions. And I think having a good relationship with your bookkeeper in a way that you can get things out of the financial software quickly and have things recoded when you need them quickly is important if you don't have an internal person. You might have an accountant on your board, and that person might work with you to make sure that you're handling certain accounting concepts in a way that make the most sense for your organization, depreciation and secured funds and whatnot. And then ultimately your audited financial statements are usually, the annual audit is handled by an outside firm. It's required as part of your annual filings. And then just to mention again, cash flow budgets. I think we should talk about that as we get into the next section and sort of meat of this discussion, the how, but basically a way of breaking out your budget into sort of a monthly or quarterly periods so you can see when you're anticipating money coming in, when money going out, and particularly with small organizations, are we going to have enough money in the bank at any given point to make payroll, which is the thing that keeps us all up at night. Any questions about any of those things? Happy to get into more of those given.
The one question that I've seen, I'm not sure it's entirely relevant yet. I think you might get to it, but it's like Jody also asks, is there an industry practice for allocating a festival budget when some overhead and staff are year-round for an institute and others are temporarily full-time for a festival? So balancing those two things. I'm not sure if that's maybe off topic right now, but I'm just
Well,
chiming in.
it does come up, and I think you know, it just, again, it's just, these are just the subtle differences between different organizations and different festivals, and that's why you can't have one answer to all these questions, because people
Right.
just have different situations.
Right.
You know, at the Film Society, when I first started here 3 years ago on the film festival, they only hired, like, you know, literally a handful of people to work on the festival, and everyone else who worked here. And since I've been here, we definitely have hired more people, because also the festival has just grown. It's just bigger, and you just can't handle it with all the people on staff. But basically, our entire staff works on the New York Film Festival. I can't really think of one person that isn't somehow involved in it, and that affects greatly our budget, because obviously we're using our employees in the marketing department, in special events and development, print traffic, programming. You know, it would be hard to, and we don't even attempt to try to figure out, well, how much time is somebody taking for the New York Film Festival, so that we can kind of put that in our budget to figure out what our, you know, our real budget is, so to speak. But again, these are just the subtle differences between everyone's different circumstances.
Yeah,
And
that question though comes up all the time, because in San Francisco, where I was managing director, the what percentage of your overhead would you attribute to the festival is a question that comes up. And again, we didn't attempt to do that out there. There had been some talk over the years, because it's part of how you tell your story. You know, if your festival budget is X dollars, and it seems like a small percentage of your overall financial picture, yet it's the most high profile event, and it seems like you're spending half the year doing it, well then those numbers might not tell your story correctly. And if you want to tell your story correctly, well then maybe you'd go down that route. You know, our rent is $100,000 a year, and for half of the year 80% of our overhead costs are directly festival related. So let's put that in the budget. So there are approaches to it. I don't think there's an industry standard, because I've seen it both ways. But I would say it comes down to the story you want to tell. The other thing that I think is worth noting, and it goes to your audited financial statements, is if something seems not particularly transparent, or it raises an eyebrow with the CPA who's doing your audited financial statement, they'll either bring it up and want to know what the story is, or they'll include a note in your audited financial statements, because they're putting their firm's reputation on the line when they say these books are in order. If it's not correct, they don't want to, misrepresent the financial statement. So I think if your question is, do you have to do that? I think that's a question for the accountant who's doing your audited financial statements. If the question is, I'd like to better represent what the festival's budget is so that we're telling our story more accurately, that's the other way to look at it. All right, I muted my my thing there because I thought we were moving on, but let's move on. And this again is where I thought we would spend some real time, because I certainly wish that somebody had sat down with me and gave me some tips on how to do this. And I think, to Leslie's point, that there isn't one way to do it. I certainly found out a few years ago when I was trying to redo the chart of accounts. And I think this is something that you might endeavor if you're working on a budget that was created 20 years ago, and every year you just keep doing it, and it's like, this doesn't make sense anymore. We're just not doing it this way anymore. So that's something that I undertook, but I didn't know, is there an industry standard or something like that? And I came up with this idea that I wanted in the chart of accounts, again, these line items with numbers, I wanted the items that represent year-round activity closer to the top, so that in my cash flow budget, the stuff that I was spending money on, and this was a June event, in the fall and the winter, was at the top of the page. I just thought it would be more clear, and I figured maybe that somebody else has had that idea, or maybe that's even an industry standard. And I started calling my festival colleagues and saying, is this the way you should do it? And most of the time I would get responses like, yeah, it sounds good, go for it. But it wasn't like there was a,
Mhm.
and I think this also is a kind of something that Leslie and I have shared, just sort of in that we both worked on film productions. And what I was craving was that kind of codification of the budgeting process,
Yeah.
because it seems like a film budget was so the same from one project to another. Leslie, you want to talk about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when you're working on a film, particularly if it's a film like for a distributor or for a production company or a studio or whatever, and you have a budget and you have to kind of stick to the budget. It's not a question really. You're expected actually to be able to keep up with a budget. You're expected to be able to create one, first of all, that really takes into consideration all the aspects of the production. And you're sort of required to stick to the budget. And sometimes there's even a bond company that you have to report to. And I've done many, many, reports to bond companies using my, you know, my uh, my income reports and my expense reports, and matched it against my budget and created a budget versus actual. And you know it's sort of a, I think in film what you do more than maybe in festivals is you're tracking your expenses very, very closely, like every day. You're doing it, and in some ways that is what you have to do on a festival. And I think that's certainly what we do, is that we very closely track our expenses, because you can really get caught with your pants down at the end when you realize that actually you haven't accounted for some big expense. Some of that is like having purchase orders or not having purchase orders, or a system in place so that you can actually track expenses. Um, but some of it is just more common sense than that. It's just a kind of common sense thing of understanding what monies are going out, making adjustments to that based on what monies are coming in, and tracking things as carefully as you can, and accountability as well. I think that who controls the budget and who controls money in a festival is also changeable. Some festivals, again, are part of bigger operations, and so there may be a financial team. There's an accountant or a CFO who may play a very big role. Oftentimes there is no such person officially like that. It's really like a festival producer or executive director who ends up effectively being the frontline person for budgeting. But what I would advise is that I wouldn't necessarily advise that you have to share your whole budget with everybody. Don't I don't necessarily think that's true, but you have to share the information that's in your budget, and you have to have a relationship with the people who are running your different departments where money is being spent, so that they have an understanding of what their budget is. You can't really get mad at a print traffic person who spent twice their budget when you've never told them what the budget is. You can't really fault anyone if they're not sort of have an ownership stake somehow in your budgeting. And again, that doesn't mean that they have to see the entire budget, but at least if they know what their part of the budget includes, and ideally, that they're involved in creating or crafting those lines and budgets numbers so that they are, again, they have ownership and they can feel more accountable. One thing that's really challenging in budgeting is that, it is a team effort in that you can know that you have a budget that has to fit into $250,000. That's like your budget for your festival, and you as the person in charge might lean on that number heavily. Like that is something that's really like the number that you're sticking with, and you have to make your budget and all of that. And you know you have to be able to trust and share with your team that they are responsible for certain parts of that. And you want them to have accountability. And again, um, you want them to be invested in making sure that your budget is you're holding the line with your budget. And so I think, whereas I'm not a believer in group budgeting, just to be very clear about that, I don't think budgeting is a group effort, but there are things about budgeting that require you to work with your team, get information, share information, and of course, track the expenses. And that is a very big part of what any department head needs to do.
And this is a really interesting part of the process, and it's something that it took me a couple of years of trying to get a budget together before I got to a place where I started feeling like it's more than me locking myself in a room for 4 days with the detailed P&L and trying to come up with this year's numbers. And basically, if you look at this slide here, I should almost reverse this. I think it's important, and it doesn't have to be complicated. I have one that I can share here, but it's basically your organization's budget policy. And I think it's important that the board um, vote and approve on an organizational policy, which is the board requires this on this date or this amount of time beforehand, so that there's an expectation of how the process is going to roll out, from which you can backdate the time allocated to getting input from staff, making the case for certain business decisions. And I think this is one of the things that I never felt like I was getting adequate feedback in, particularly from the board, was I want to undertake this new thing. It's somewhat entrepreneurial, or there's some risk involved, but this is why the production line for video projection is double what it was last year. I think if we enable this theater, we're going to be able to sell more tickets, and that's why in this line item the ticket revenue has gone up by 30%. That is in the budget, and someone who's super familiar with it might be able to discern that without a big discussion. But I think if you're going to undertake changes, business decisions, then the board really needs to be engaged in that conversation. But similarly, the staff does. So you need to build in the sort of feedback loops for both staff and board before you get too far along the line where you need it approved the next week, particularly when you're holding up some of the staff questions around, can we spend this? And that's something that you never want to be in a position for, but often you are, because the board hasn't approved something or whatnot. So it's important from a project management point of view that there's a policy and a timeline for how the approval process will take place. I've been in some organizations where there's a master budget, and the department's section of the master budget is distributed to the department heads with a spreadsheet that's linked to that section of their budget. Yeah, I think there's some merit to doing things that way, particularly if you have enough senior staff who are kind of running like mini businesses within the organization. You know, they've got all the line items related to their event, their department, and they can go through that same pencil sharpening process, lock themselves in their office and really hash it out internally with their team to come to those numbers and have those flow directly into some master budget. And that's not particularly complicated to set up in Excel, and it's another way to go. We could pause for a little bit because I feel like since we're in the how stage of talking about budgeting, I'd certainly love to hear what other people are struggling with and questions or maybe some suggestions. We have a question from Rachel Walker. Hi, Rachel. Should we ever take into account things we assume will be donated when budgeting, or price everything out, aim towards that number, and just hope we get donated what we need? This is going to be a kind of a individual style to budgeting. My approach was always be extremely conservative. I wouldn't put in the income anything that wasn't 100% sure of or fairly close to sure of. So there's two benefits to that. You can be reasonably sure that you're going to hit your numbers, but the other thing is you're more likely to look good at the end of it because things that come through that you weren't 100% sure of, just sweeten the bottom line. So, but it is a little tricky, particularly when you're talking about in-kind things, flights, for example. If you have an airline sponsor who you've relied on year for a significant component of what it would cost to bring your filmmakers in, and they go away, you're faced with a kind of a tough situation. Do you plan to go forward, sort of status quo, and hope that you get another sponsor? Do you budget for the actual cost of what it's going to cost to fly everybody in? And in a lot of cases, you would never be able to afford that. Or do you come up with a much smaller number for travel and say, I'm sorry, team, this is what we've got. If something comes through later on, we can talk about doing more, but right now I can only commit to bringing 10 filmmakers in or whatnot. That's a big question. Some boards will get involved in this regard. Nobody wants a festival with no filmmakers coming. So sometimes you have a wealthy board member who will say, while we're sorting this out, I think it's important that you guys can move forward comfortably. So I'm going to guarantee, a certain amount of money for filmmaker travel, just so you can move forward. But again, these are very individual situations. Rachel, does that address your question? Thanks.
Can't hear you.
She typed thank you.
Oh.
Well, while we're waiting for other questions.
Wait, sorry, okay. Rachel, I just unmuted you if you want to have more of a conversation with Colin.
Oh no, that's fine.
Okay. She's like, I'm fine. All set.
One of the things I wanted to bring up here is that in the short time I've been here at the Film Society and working with Lesli, it's been a new education from a budgeting point of view, because for those of you who don't know her, she's exceptionally skilled in this regard, and it's why we're so excited at the festival forum that she's had been talking about doing this for some time. And the thing that I've noticed and I've been encouraged to do here is the whole thing, which is the follow through on the budget, managing it as a living document, and monitoring expenses. I'm not proud of the fact that I didn't used to have a system for this? Because it just kind of got a little nuts when you got close to the festival date. You worked hard to contain costs, kind of knew where you were, and then you start getting all of these things that you hadn't planned for, like so and so. Our tributee is coming. We've sold tickets to. They've been in all our press releases. We didn't have a conversation about hair and makeup, and they're demanding that we pay for it, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's going to cost $5,000 to bring these people in. They have a day rate of some crazy amount. It's like, well, what the hell? It's not in our budget at all. And you kind of look at it and you say, well, we're up 10,000 in ticket sales this so far, and sold a few more passes. So yes, what am I going to say? But it wasn't sort of like I had a place to plug that in, so I kind of knew where we were going, and that's one of the things that that I think is an important part of the whole process. And I think, again, coming from a film background, yeah, you talk to your line producer every day about where you're at with expenses, because things are vacillating depending on whether you've gone into overtime or whatnot with your crew. And is that something that you have done your whole career, or is that something that's become increasingly important to you as
Me?
the stakes of
Well, I think that as a filmmaker, there was a point at which I realized that I had to own the budgeting process, and that it's power. Knowledge is power when it comes to this money and when it comes to budgeting. And I've done similar seminars, many more actually, on film budgeting and particularly documentary budgeting, because again, I kind of think people are scared of math and they're scared of money. People don't like to talk about rates. That's like a big issue. People don't want to talk about how much they should make, how much other people should make. There's just a sort of thing that I think can happen where people just aren't open about it. But I felt like as I was getting into doing more of my own films, crafting a budget, controlling the budget, became like one of the most important skills that I could develop. And particularly, I ran my own company for many years. It's it's my money effectively, and it's a company that's hiring me to produce a film. And I'm accountable to them. I actually have to produce this thing, and it has to be delivered in a very particular way. And it can get you very up, you can get up to speed very quickly when that's part of what you're required to do. I'm personally interested in budgeting because I do feel that it's often a lack. It's just the last thing people want to deal with. And so often it truly is exactly the last thing that people deal with. And so they don't write a budget, or they don't stick with it, or, I've been in many situations with festival folks where I've talked to them, and, someone will have created a budget, but then they kind of lock it in their desk for the rest of the year. Like they write it up and they know what money they think they need to spend, or that they want to make, but they truly never consult it. And they're not monitoring their expenses and stuff. And so I think it's something that I've gotten more interested in as I've gotten into more positions of responsibility in some ways, because it's just, I have to know it. And then the other part of it is just the empowerment part, which is that I feel like I felt more empowered as a filmmaker, knowing more about budgeting and having more of the tools myself. And I kind of feel the same way about festival work. You're just in a position of knowledge and power when you know what the budget is, you're in control of it, and you can't be bullied or pushed around by other people. And then there's a fairness aspect to things too. I just want to say that, like, you know, rates for certain jobs, you know, um, have to do with the scale of economy of the festival you're working on. Sometimes you can be a hospitality coordinator on a festival where you make $600 a week or 700 or 750, but you may work on a bigger festival and maybe they can afford more, they have more needs. Maybe that rate is more, it's $1,000. Rates may change depending on the scale of economy of a particular festival, but not necessarily within a large range. And also, I'm a very big, you have to pay people proper salaries. That's just my feeling. Not everyone can afford to do that. And that's why we all so often rely on volunteers. I think that the secret that we don't want to say, that is the sort of dirty little secret of how we get these festivals done, is that we in fact don't pay everyone who works on it. In fact, lots and lots of people are volunteers, and there are certain degrees in terms of the festival you work on, but, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know in my dealings, either having worked at Sundance and even just dealing with folks there, that, some very important jobs that require a lot of responsibility are done by volunteers. They're not people even in paid positions. And in some cases, that is like the gift that you can't get enough of. That is that a volunteer person who has a vested interest, they're interested in your organization. Some people can't afford to be patrons. And that's okay, because they have the time to volunteer and they're giving something else to your organization. And to me, that's, as valuable as, a patron who can contribute cash. You need that, but you need the workforce. And that, I think, in some ways is the difference between some of the sort of small, medium, and larger festivals, is the personnel. Who can you afford to hire? How much money can you afford to spend? In some festivals, again, very little. I mean, when I was working at New Fest, we were a lot of people were working as volunteers.
Just Just one thing to keep in mind. I know you said earlier it's very, very rare for festivals to be for profit, but if you do, the volunteers, we had an issue at Tribeca where we learned that we weren't allowed to have so many volunteers, that, without giving them training and things like that to make it more of an internship. So that was interesting.
No, I think that's a very good point. And I'll say that at the volunteers, and I'll just say one quick thing about volunteers, and I'll get off of that, which is that when I started the Film Society, they used to get like 20 volunteers for the festival. And that was because they required any volunteer to be available for the entire festival. And so some of this is just advantages of technology and being able to have better scheduling software that allows you to have volunteers even schedule themselves, and all of those things that, we all use for volunteer work. But just the call to call out to ask for volunteers, I think we had 200 the first year after we had 20. But what we found is that, we felt it was appropriate to give people back a membership in the organization based on how much time they worked. So there's a formula that's created, that's part of the sort of package that volunteers get when they even consider being a volunteer, which explains that there's a formula, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but it has to do with the number of shifts equaling a level of membership. So after you've done X number of volunteer shifts, you're a regular member. After you do another series of them, you go up another level. And it is something that we feel strongly about, because obviously we want the people who volunteer to get a benefit from it. And for us, the great benefit is for them to become members.
We also at Tribeca, we called them crew eventually, and they had the opportunity to come to sessions with various heads of departments to hear about what they do and how things work. And so there's an education element to it too, which is nice. I think we're getting a little off topic here at the end, but let's, that was great. I just don't want to go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, I did want to bring just one last thing before, I don't know if we have a strict end date, but.
No, we don't.
So one of the things that I think is an important part of the managing of a budget is being able to break it out in a way that represents actual chunks of spending. And I think one of the things, and Leslie and I've talked about this, you'll often see budgets that are so consolidated that you've got line items that that contain a number of things that should just be discrete. And it's if that's being generated in your financial software, you know, whoever's, the finance director or whatnot, they're not going to want to play with that very much. So you have to maintain some adherence to that budget, but it's not very helpful for you when you have a single line item with all of this stuff that you need to track kind of rolled into it. And I think one of the things that when you create a working budget, or maybe it's a cash flow budget, is to be able to clearly show that that breakout, and just using some very standard um, financial reporting formats, so that you've got, a list of things that constitute one line item underneath it indented, and that they sum and then roll over to the column where the totals are. It gives you the flexibility of saying, okay, well, there's $1,000 here for lighting and $1,000 for pipe and drape, and I have a podium for 275 and radios for 520. And then you can start comparing those to the actual costs without looking at one big number and saying, well, I've only spent $1,000 so far. What's the rest of this going to be? So though creating those working documents, I think, is an important thing. I think Google Docs is actually a good tool, because you can share it with a number of people who need to have access to it. But I think a relationship
And
with
you can also restrict who can edit it and who can't.
Exactly.
I think, yeah.
But I think the relationship with your bookkeeper is paramount, because ultimately your numbers have to agree, and you have to be aware of the various ways that money is being spent. It's easy to monitor checks that are going out, but maybe you've got reoccurring payments for some uh, utilities and whatnot, or as you get closer to the festival, you've got all of these flights being booked on credit cards, and so like, what's the system for monitoring in real time everything that's being spent? Because if you rely on your bookkeeper, particularly if they're not in house, it can take a long time sometimes for everything to be booked and then to reconcile the bank account. And if you're depending on knowing how much money you have in your bank at any given moment to know whether you can even write that check, it can become quite a frustrating exercise to not know where you stand financially at any given moment. And interesting, when we had that Art House Convergence uh, series of panels, I think we ended up going in this direction for a while with one of the other panelists, and he had almost the exact same experience, where he was so frustrated with his external bookkeeper that he brought the bookkeeping in-house, and so that he could have real-time access. And I think that's an individual thing that organizations need to figure out, like, how comfortable are you with your financial software? And just to add one last layer to that, I think uh, you should feel comfortable enough in requiring a system that works for you. Because if it doesn't work for you and you're running an organization, you've got one hand tied behind your back. And one example of this, a friend of mine who runs an event company uh, decided that she wanted her bookkeeper to start using uh, QuickBooks Online. So QuickBooks has a web-based version of their software. Now the bookkeeper hated this because they'd been using their own client-based version of this and knew every keystroke in the book, and they could bang things out in no time. So when they had to start accessing their QuickBooks using a browser and pulling down menus and whatnot, it probably added some work to their day. But at the end of it, that person who was running this company could access their books from anywhere, could write checks from anywhere, and could answer questions at any given moment. So if your bookkeeping system is not working for you, you know, demand that it is. And I think that's something that's, I wish I had had that advice early on as well.
I have one question, and you may have totally covered this. I did get up for a couple of minutes before, but when you talk about involving staff and department heads, is there how much leeway? You may, if you answered this, just say I answered it. How much leeway do you give department heads? Do you give them like a block number and then let them kind of divvy it up, or are you involved as the head of the director of a festival? Are you involved in every little decision?
It depends, I think that, we have certain amounts of money that we think we want to spend, for example, in marketing, and those marketing dollars are broken out in different lines, on air stuff, or subway posts, outdoor advertising, digital advertising. They may be broken out in different pots in different lines in the budget. But often I will go to the marketing department and say, okay, well, here's the sort of the lines, and here's the pot of money we have in each one. And if you want to spend a little bit more money in digital versus outdoor, that's fine. It's up to you guys to tell me where you want to spend the money. I feel like I am more involved in probably what the round number is that we're giving them, than I am in the detail of where every dollar is going. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
When you have a department that this is all about trust and all that, this you just sort of trust them, but they know what they're doing, and they're letting me know what the plan is. When we have something like I think one thing we found, and it's not fair necessarily to use the New York Film Festival as an example, but that's just my experience and my example. So that's the best one I can call up is, we instituted production meetings for the film festival that begin right about after our gala is done in April. But around, the end of April, beginning of May, we are starting in on a weekly meeting of the film festival. And what that that just allows for us to have a more long-term and continuous discussion about all these points, and actually allows us to have a long-term plan for these departments, so that I don't really question whether a dollar goes here or there, because they've also been talking to me about their plan. Does that make sense? So it's not just a random thing out of nowhere. It's part of a process of working together, all of us on the festival, that allows us to know what the strategy is and what the plan is for that year.
And I imagine also that there's, each, as people stay year to year to year, you guys get into a rhythm. It's harder when you have a new person in charge of a department each year.
Yeah, I mean, this is the fourth year that virtually everyone at the Film Society is the same group of people. The fourth year in a row, that we're all working together. And so I think that there is a great deal of shorthand that goes on. And when a new person, Colin, comes in, he is bringing his perspective from his experience, which is similar but not the same. And I think that if one of the reasons that we, in any festival, presumably, but certainly I know my own experience, is that we can easily integrate seasonal people because they are such pros at what they do. So, we can bring in, last year we had a very difficult situation where we had the head of print traffic for the whole film society, the entire film society, became ill, and unfortunately he subsequently passed away, actually, in the winter time. But this happened like 2 weeks before the festival. So before the festival, the head of print traffic basically became ill, and this, as you can imagine, is a huge crisis, right? So
Right, right.
print traffic is pretty much, at some point, it's like the most important job at a festival in some ways, right? But what we were able to do is pretty quickly go out to our colleagues in the film festival community and say, essentially, we have an emergency. We have a situation where we have to bring somebody in who can pick up where this person has left off. And we were very fortunate because we were able to find actually 2 people who came in, but they were both so skilled and such high, had so much experience themselves that it didn't take more than a few hours to acclimate them to what we were doing, and they just kind of went and did their thing.
I mean, that also speaks to the importance of having good records and documentation too, and that everyone knows. I had an old boss who used to call it the get hit by a bus protocol. Like, you had to make if you got hit by a bus, and you had to make sure the world could go on the next day, in terms of your job. So
that's right.
So that's,
I think to the question too about the involvement of the staff and the leeway that is afforded to them, I think that there's a kind of a 2 hats you have to wear. I think the last webinar we did, where one of the title, in fact, I think may have been "We're all in the marketing team," which I think is really apt, and I think it really underscores, we're all working towards the same thing, and it's not great if you have an antagonistic relationship with some of the staff who are just constantly asking you for more money. I mean, and this is one hat, and I feel like that is consensus building around your programmatic priorities. If everyone feels the same way about what the organization's priorities are, then it's not going to feel unfair if more resources are being allocated to that programmatic priority. But if there's people on the staff who are feeling short-shrifted about how much money they're getting to spend on their programs, then they're not going to be particularly bought into the budget process. And I think that comes from, strategic planning exercises. What's the sort of landscape surveys? Like, where are we going? Where are the opportunities for this organization? Maybe this program that we've done all of these years, it's just not working anymore. The audiences have matured, or tastes have changed, or it's just not making money anymore. So, like, there's that bit of consensus building. But on the other hand, at the end of the day, the buck stops with you, because that's what you've been hired to do, which is bring this organization in on budget. And some of those decisions aren't always going to be popular. And to the degree that you can engage the board in that decision-making process, the less you're going to feel sort of like the bad guy. But if it comes to the fact that you have to reduce the budget because there's just not enough money, or you've spent through, some sort of gift, hard decisions are often required, and no amount of consensus is going to make letting some people go any easier. So those are the 2 hats. I feel like you have to engage in consensus building with the staff around programmatic priorities, but at the end of the day, what's your ultimate feeling about what's in the best interest of the organization, given your responsibility as the chief executive?
It's getting to be 4:15, so I think we want to think about wrapping up. I think that Leslie mentioned earlier that she would be able to share a sample budget, which I can send along with send as a follow-up and I can send it to everyone who RSVP'd, because I know some people RSVP'd just so they would make sure to get the recording later. I know late August is a hard time to do anything in New York City, and anywhere, I think. So that would be great. I don't know if you have a Google Doc that we could share, just as might be a good way to do that. That's open to anybody, viewing. Might be one way to do it, or if it's an Excel sheet or whatever, we can work that out. Does anyone else have any final questions for our moderators? I want to say thank you to Lesli and Colin. Anybody out there still?
Mhm.
I still see you there. So, and I also just want to make one more plea or call out about IFP Film Week coming up in September. It's the third week in September, the 15th to 18th. Is that 14th to 18th, I believe? And the 2 days of the festival forum are the 16th and 17th. And we hope that you'll join us there and come meet colleagues in real life and have real life conversations and networking and learn more about all the best practices that we've all kind of come to agree upon, even if it's only in our heads. So we hope to see you then. Please visit IFP Festival Forum on Facebook and on the website and Twitter and everywhere else. So thank you. We see some thank yous coming in on the chat room. Any last minute words of advice, Lesli and Colin? Don't be afraid of math.
Don't be afraid of math. Math is your friend.
Exactly. Yeah, thanks, Kristen.
It's funny how that comes up. It really does. It percolates up.
Yeah, I find the math is the least bit. You know, it's just cell 1 plus cell 2.
It's more conceptual. That's the hard part. Jody, I just unmuted you too if you want to say anything.
Great. No, I just wanted to say thank you so much, guys. This is really interesting, and I think people will really value getting to see that sample.
Great. We'll send you some stuff then, because I think we have a few docs that we could share.
Great. And then I'll make sure everyone gets them. So thanks so much, you guys. And we'll see you in September. And then otherwise, we'll see you in October right back here. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.